The year was 1888. Wyoming Territory stretched beneath an unforgiving sky, a vast canvas of muted browns and bruised purples where the wind spoke in mournful sighs through the sparse, twisted pines. On the Blackwood Ranch, silence was a shroud, heavy and suffocating, draped over the weathered clapboard house and the leaning fences that sagged like tired shoulders. Ethan Blackwood wore his grief like a second skin, stitched into the lines around his eyes, embedded in the set of his jaw. It had been 2 years since Eliza was taken by the fever, 2 years since the laughter had been leached from the air, leaving only the hollow echo of what was. The land, once a testament to shared dreams, now mirrored the desolation in his soul. Each sunrise was a fresh torment, each sunset a bitter reminder of the emptiness that awaited him within the cold walls of his home. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light that pierced the grimy windows, illuminating the neglect that had crept in, insidious and thorough. Eliza's flower garden, once vibrant with columbine and prairie rose, was now a tangle of weeds, a choked memorial. He worked from before dawn until long after dusk, the harsh labor of familiar penance, his movements stiff, his words rarer than rain in a drought. His hands, calloused and strong, knew only the feel of reins, axe handles, the cold steel of tools. They had forgotten the language of tenderness. The ranch was failing, not for lack of effort, but because the heart had gone out of it, just as it had gone out of him. He ate standing, tasteless meals of jerky and stale bread, the effort of cooking a burden too great to bear on top of the monumental weight of his sorrow. The silence of the house pressed in, amplifying the gnawing hunger that was more than just physical. It was a hunger for something to break the spell, a desperate, unspoken plea for an end to the ceaseless mourning. He'd finally conceded, a terse note penned and sent with a passing rider to the nearest town, an advertisement for a cook. A woman. The thought was a practical one, devoid of any other expectation. Someone to manage the hearth, to lay a plate on the table. Someone to occupy a small corner of the oppressive silence, without disturbing the larger, sacred silence he kept for Eliza. He expected little, hoped for less. It was merely a function, a cog in the broken machinery of his life. He did not consider what kind of woman would answer such a call, to journey to a place so steeped in quiet despair, so far from the pulse of the world. He only knew the gnawing emptiness in his belly and the deeper void in his chest demanded some form of tending, however impersonal, however brief. The wind whispered Eliza's name, or perhaps it was just the rustle of dying leaves, a sound that had become indistinguishable from the landscape of his heart. The stagecoach, a lumbering beast of scarred wood and iron, had deposited Sarah Miller at the dusty crossroads miles from anywhere that felt like civilization. Her small, worn valleys held all her worldly possessions, her heart a repository of carefully guarded sorrows and a resilience forged in the crucible of a past she never spoke of. She had come from the east, a world of brick and clamor, now a distant memory, trading it for the stark, open immensity of the plains. The advertisement had been a lifeline, a thin thread of possibility in a tapestry of dwindling options. Cook wanted. Remote ranch. Fair wages. The words were as sparse as the landscape she now found herself in. She had walked the final miles, the sun beating down, the dust coating her worn boots and the hem of her plain, dark dress. Each step was a quiet prayer, a testament to her enduring spirit. The Blackwood Ranch, when it finally emerged from the heat haze, looked like a place that had surrendered. The house slumped, paint peeling, the porch sagging. A lone figure, tall and broad-shouldered, moved near the barn, his actions economical, imbued with a weariness that transcended the physical. This was Ethan Blackwood, the man whose grief was an almost palpable presence, even from a distance. As she approached, her shadow stretching long before her, he straightened, his eyes, the color of a stormy sky, fixing on her. There was no welcome in his gaze, only a deep, abiding sorrow and a flicker of something unreadable, perhaps surprise that anyone had answered his summons at all. She felt a pang, not of fear, but of a strange, poignant understanding. His desolation called to a hidden strength within her, a quiet knowing that she, too, had walked through shadows. She stopped a respectful distance away, her hands clasped before her, her demeanor calm, her gaze steady. The silence between them was broken only by the creak of a loose shutter on the house, a mournful sigh from the structure itself. She waited, a solitary figure of quiet dignity against the backdrop of an indifferent sky, ready to offer her skills, her labor, in exchange for a place to simply be. Her own past was a locked room, but her present was a single, focused intention to survive, and perhaps, in the service of another's survival, to find a sliver of peace for herself. The wind whipped a strand of her brown hair across her face, and she tucked it back, her movement unhurried, graceful. She was not afraid of the silence, nor of the visible hardship. She had known worse. Ethan Blackwood looked at the woman standing before him, her presence an unexpected punctuation mark in the long, rambling sentence of his solitude. She was not what he had envisioned, though he couldn't have said what that vision entailed. Perhaps someone older, more weathered by prairie life. This woman, Sarah Miller, as she introduced herself in a low, steady voice, was slender, with a quiet composure that seemed out of place amidst the ranch's decay, yet somehow, not fragile. Her eyes, a clear, thoughtful hazel, met his directly, without artifice or boldness, simply observing. He noted the dust on her sensible boots, the neatness of her mended dress, the way her hands, though showing signs of work, were held with a certain grace. There was a story in her stillness, a history he would not ask about, nor she offer. His own was written too plainly on his face, in the slump of his shoulders, in the very air around him. "You can cook." His voice was rough, rusted from disuse, the question blunt, almost brutal. He had no energy for pleasantries, no space in his constricted world for anything beyond the stark necessities. Sarah nodded once. "Yes, sir. Plain cooking, but wholesome. I can bake bread, manage a garden, keep a clean kitchen." Her words were few, direct, matching his own economy. She did not elaborate on her skills, nor did she offer references he had not requested. There was a quiet confidence in her assertion that resonated more deeply than any lengthy testament. He looked towards the house, his house, a place that had once been filled with warmth and the scent of Eliza's baking. Now, it was a mausoleum of memory. The thought of another woman in that kitchen, Eliza's kitchen, sent a sharp pang through him, a betrayal he hadn't anticipated. Yet, the gnawing hunger, the sheer, bone-deep exhaustion of fending for himself in this hollow shell of a life, was a more immediate tyrant. He needed this. He needed someone to light the stove, to bring a semblance of order to the chaos that mirrored his internal state. "The wages are $20 a month, room and board," he stated, the terms laid out like stones. "You'll have the small room off the pantry. Keep to yourself. I expect the meals on time." It was not an offer, but a decree. Sarah absorbed his conditions without a flicker of expression. The austerity of his terms did not surprise her, it was etched into the landscape, into the man himself. "That is acceptable, Mr. Blackwood," she replied, her voice even. There was no hesitation, no bargaining. Only a quiet acceptance that spoke of her own pressing needs, her own journey to this desolate doorstep. He grunted, a sound that was neither assent nor dissent, but perhaps a reluctant acknowledgement. He gestured towards the house with a curt nod of his head. "The kitchen's through there. You can start," and with that, he turned his broad back to her, and strode towards the barn, the brief, stark transaction complete. He did not look back, did not offer to help with her valise, did not offer a single word of welcome. He had hired a cook, a pair of hands. Nothing more. Or so he told himself, the echo of her quiet voice lingering in the air longer than he would have liked, a single, unexpected note in the symphony of his grief. Sarah Miller watched Ethan Blackwood retreat, his figure diminishing against the backdrop of the vast, indifferent land. She picked up her valise, its meager weight a familiar burden, and walked towards the house. The porch groaned under her step, a sound of weary complaint. The front door, paint flaking like sunburnt skin, opened onto a dim hallway that smelled of dust, disuse, and a faint, lingering sorrow that seemed to seep from the very walls. She found the kitchen at the back, a large, once welcoming space now fallen into neglect. A fine layer of grime coated every surface. Pots and pans hung askew, some bearing the remnants of long-ago meals. The great iron stove, the heart of any kitchen, stood cold and silent, its black surface dulled with ash and soot. It was a daunting sight, but Sarah felt no despair, only a quiet resolve. This was work, tangible and necessary. She set down her valise in the small, barren room off the pantry, a cot, a rickety washstand, a single window looking out onto a patch of withered grass. It was enough. Back in the kitchen, she tied on the apron she'd carried, its clean linen a stark contrast to her surroundings. She began with the stove, methodically clearing out the old ashes, her movements efficient, practiced. She found wood stacked haphazardly outside the back door, kindling, and soon, a small, hesitant flame flickered to life, the first spark of warmth the kitchen had known in what felt like an eternity. The simple act of lighting the fire was a ritual, a quiet claiming of the space. She found potatoes and onions in a bin, a side of bacon hanging in the cool larder, flour in a stone crock. Basic ingredients, but enough. As she worked, peeling vegetables, kneading a simple dough for biscuits, the kitchen slowly began to shed its air of abandonment. The scent of onion sizzling in the bacon fat, a homely, comforting aroma, began to permeate the silent house, tentative at first, then more insistent, a fragrant messenger of change. It was a smell of life, of sustenance, a stark contrast to the lingering scent of sorrow. When Ethan Blackwood finally entered, hours later, the sun beginning its descent, he stopped in the doorway, his face unreadable. The kitchen was transformed. Surfaces gleamed faintly in the lamplight she had lit. A pot simmered on the stove, releasing savory steam. A plate with a simple meal, stew, fresh biscuits, a portion of preserved peaches she'd found, sat on the scrubbed wooden table. He said nothing. He simply sat, his large frame seeming to dwarf the chair, and began to eat. Sarah poured him a cup of coffee, black and strong, and placed it beside his plate, then retreated to the scullery, leaving him to the unfamiliar solitude of a meal prepared by another's hands. He ate slowly, deliberately. The food was good. More than good. It was nourishing, warm, real. A forgotten sensation, a small comfort in the vast wilderness of his grief. He tasted the care in it, the quiet competence. He found himself finishing every last morsel, the warmth spreading through him, a feeling so alien it was almost alarming. He looked around the kitchen, at the order she had wrought in just a few hours. A single candle flickered on the table, its flame a small, brave defiance against the encroaching darkness. For the first time in 2 years, the house did not feel entirely empty. The days that followed settled into a quiet rhythm, dictated by the rising and setting of the sun, the needs of the ranch, and the steady, unobtrusive presence of Sarah Miller. Ethan worked his land with the same fierce, silent dedication as before, but now, the aromas of baking bread or simmering stew would drift on the wind, reaching him in the fields, a subtle, almost subliminal reminder that he was no longer entirely alone in his toil. He would return to the house at noon and dusk to find meals laid out, the kitchen clean, a quiet order prevailing where chaos had once reigned. He still spoke little, and Sarah even less. Their exchanges were utilitarian, a request for more wood, a question about supplies. Yet, a delicate, unspoken awareness began to weave itself between them. He found himself watching her sometimes, when he thought she wasn't aware. He'd see her tending the small patch of earth by the kitchen door, coaxing green shoots from the neglected soil where Eliza's herbs once grew. He'd observe the way her hands moved, deft and sure, whether she was kneading dough, mending a torn curtain, or polishing the dull silver of Eliza's candlesticks, which she had found tucked away in a dusty box. She brought them out not as a replacement, but as a quiet honoring. She did not intrude on his grief, did not pry into the locked rooms of his past. She simply existed, a calm, steady presence, bringing life back to the deadened spaces of his home, not with noise or forced cheer, but with gentle, persistent care. Her quietude was not emptiness, but a deep well of resilience. He saw it in the set of her shoulders as she faced the endless tasks, in the way she met his gaze, unflinching but without challenge. Sarah, too, was aware of his gaze. She felt it on her back as she worked, a heavy, assessing presence. It was not unkind, not predatory, but laden with a sorrow so profound it was almost a physical weight. She saw the way his eyes would sometimes linger on an object Eliza had cherished, a faded quilt, a particular teacup, and the pain that would flicker across his face, raw and unguarded. She understood grief, its lonely terrain. She moved through his house with a quiet respect for its ghosts, disturbing nothing of his private sorrow, yet her very presence was a subtle challenge to its supremacy. The silence between them began to change. It was no longer the barren, echoing silence of utter desolation. Now, it was a shared quiet, punctuated by the domestic sounds of her work, the crackle of the fire, the distant lowing of cattle. It was a silence that held space for observation, for the slow, almost imperceptible thawing of a frozen heart. He found himself anticipating the scent of coffee in the morning, the simple warmth of the kitchen when he came in from the cold. Small things. Infinitesimal shifts. But in a world stripped bare by loss, these small things began to accumulate, taking on a significance he could not yet name, would not yet acknowledge. He was a man drowning, and she, unknowingly, had thrown him a slender rope, not of rescue, but of simple, daily sustenance. The late afternoon sun cast long, melancholic shadows across the yard. Ethan was mending a section of fence line, his movements methodical, his thoughts, as always, circling back to Eliza, to the gaping hole her absence had torn in the fabric of his existence. He heard the rattle of a buggy before he saw it, an unfamiliar sound that broke the day's quiet rhythm. It was Silas Croft, a rancher from the neighboring valley, a man known more for his wagging tongue than his good sense, accompanied by his equally inquisitive wife, Martha. They rarely ventured this far, and their arrival felt like an intrusion, a violation of the fragile peace that had begun to settle over the Blackwood ranch. Ethan straightened, his face hardening into its customary stoic mask. He watched them pull up, Martha Croft's eyes already darting towards the house, alight with a curiosity that bordered on rapacious. Sarah had just stepped out onto the porch, a basket of laundry in her hands. She paused, her expression calm, but Ethan saw the slight stiffening of her shoulders. Martha Croft's gaze fixed on Sarah, sharp and appraising. "Well, now, Ethan Blackwood," Martha began, her voice carrying across the yard, syrupy sweet but edged with steel. "We heard you had company. Didn't expect someone so presentable." Her eyes raked over Sarah, lingering on her neat, if plain, appearance. The implication was clear, vulgar. A flush rose on Sarah's neck, the only sign of her discomfort. Ethan felt a surge of something hot and protective, an emotion so alien, so long dormant, it startled him. These people, with their sly insinuations and prying eyes, threatened to taint the quiet dignity Sarah had brought into his desolate world. He saw Sarah's vulnerability then, not as weakness, but as a consequence of her solitary position, a woman alone in a man's house, subject to the cruel judgments of a small, closed community. He thought of the whispers that would start, the speculation. His arrangement with Sarah, purely practical in its inception, suddenly seemed fraught with complications he hadn't foreseen. He had hired her to ease his burden, not to create a new one for her. The thought of her enduring gossip, of her quiet strength being chipped away by malicious tongues, was intolerable. As the Crofts prattled on, their words buzzing like flies, Ethan looked at Sarah. She stood there, enduring their scrutiny with a quiet fortitude that shamed him. He saw not just a cook, not just an employee, but a woman of profound integrity, caught in circumstances not of her making, offering her labor in exchange for shelter and finding herself exposed. The setting sun painted the sky in hues of blood orange and deep violet. Another night was approaching, and with it, the prospect of loneliness, of the silence that had been his only companion. But tonight, the thought of that silence felt different. It was no longer just his own sorrow he contemplated, but Sarah's precarious position, the quiet dignity she maintained against the odds. A sudden, stark realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. Her presence in his house, under his roof, needed a different kind of anchor, a different kind of protection than wages could provide. It was more than just preventing gossip, it was about acknowledging a truth that had been slowly dawning on him. Her presence was not just a convenience, it was becoming a necessity. A different kind of necessity. The thought was terrifying, exhilarating, and utterly undeniable. The Crofts finally departed, their curiosity sated, leaving a trail of disquiet in their wake. The air, which had begun to feel lighter in Sarah's presence, now felt heavy again, charged with unspoken anxieties. Evening settled, draping the ranch in its customary cloak of shadows and silence, but tonight the silence thrummed with a new tension. Sarah moved quietly about the kitchen, preparing the evening meal, her earlier composure restored, yet Ethan sensed a subtle withdrawal, a careful distancing. He ate his supper in his usual silence, but the food, usually a source of quiet comfort, tasted like ash in his mouth. His mind replayed Martha Croft's insinuating words, saw again the brief flush on Sarah's neck. He saw the loneliness in her eyes, a reflection, perhaps, of his own. He looked at her then, truly looked at her, not as an employee, but as a woman. Her strength, her quiet grace, the way she had brought a semblance of life back into his deadened world without ever asking for anything in return, without ever overstepping the invisible boundaries he had erected. She was due more than wages. She was due respect, protection, a place where she would not be subjected to the casual cruelty of gossips. He pushed his plate away, the meal unfinished. The decision, when it came, was not born of logic or careful consideration, but from a profound, visceral instinct, a sudden, desperate clarity. He stood, his chair scraping harshly against the wooden floor. Sarah looked up, her eyes questioning, a little wary. He walked towards her, stopping a few feet away. The lamplight cast half his face in shadow, highlighting the deep lines of grief and the newfound resolve etched there. "Sarah," he began, his voice raspy, unfamiliar even to himself. He rarely used her given name. What Mrs. Croft implied, it will not stand. This is a hard place for a woman alone. His words were stark, unadorned. He saw a flicker of understanding in her eyes, perhaps a hint of resignation. She probably expected him to dismiss her, to send her away to avoid further scandal. But that was not what was in his mind, not anymore. The thought of her leaving, of the house falling back into its cold, silent decay, of facing the endless nights utterly alone again, was suddenly unbearable. He took a breath, the words feeling foreign, monumental. "I cannot offer you what a woman might expect. My heart it's buried with Eliza." The admission was raw, a wound torn open. "But I can offer you my name. My protection. A home." He paused, the air thick with the unspoken. Then, the words, blunt and astonishing, even to his own ears. "Marry me, Sarah. Marry me. Today. Now." Sarah stared at Ethan Blackwood, the man of stone and sorrow, his words hanging in the air between them, heavy and unbelievable. Marry him? The proposal was devoid of any sentimentality, any whisper of affection. It was a transaction, stark and pragmatic, yet beneath the gruff exterior, she sensed a desperation that mirrored her own, and a peculiar, almost brutal form of honor. He was offering her his name, a shield against the world's harsh judgments, a permanent place in a life that had, until this moment, felt terrifyingly transient. Her mind raced. She had come to this remote ranch seeking only employment, a way to survive. She had expected hardship, loneliness, but not this. Not a proposal of marriage from a man still deeply mired in grief for his dead wife, a man whose heart was, by his own admission, buried. Yet, what were her alternatives? To return to the uncertainty she had fled? To face the whispers and conjectures that would inevitably follow her if she stayed as merely his cook, or if she left? She looked at Ethan, at the raw pain in his eyes, a pain she recognized, for her own past held its share of shadows, of losses unspoken. He was not offering love, but he was offering respect, safety. In his own stark way, he was offering a kind of partnership, a bulwark against the desolation that threatened to consume them both. She thought of the small kindnesses she had witnessed, hidden beneath his gruff exterior, the way he left fresh water for the birds, the gentleness with which he sometimes touched his horse, the flicker of something akin to gratitude in his eyes after a well-cooked meal. He was a good man, wounded but not broken beyond repair. Perhaps a shared loneliness was a foundation, however fragile, upon which something new could be built. Not love, perhaps not ever, but companionship, mutual respect, a quiet harbor. Her life had taught her that dreams of romantic love were a luxury, survival and dignity were the currencies that mattered. This offer, however unconventional, provided both. She lowered her gaze to her hands, clasped in her lap. The kitchen was quiet, the only sound the gentle hiss of the lamp and the distant cry of a coyote. When she looked up, her decision was made. Her voice, when she spoke, was as quiet and steady as ever, yet it held a new weight. "Mr. Blackwood," she began, then corrected herself, a small, almost imperceptible shift. "Ethan." "Yes. I will marry you." No joy, no girlish flutter, just a solemn acceptance of a pact made in the twilight of shared desperation and burgeoning, unspoken need. A flicker of something, relief? Surprise? Crossed his face, quickly masked. He nodded, once. "Then we ride. Now." To Reverend Thompson's, the finality in his tone matched her own. It was a decision made, a path chosen, in the dim, quiet kitchen of a grieving man's house. Ethan moved with a sudden, decisive energy that Sarah had not witnessed before. He strode out to the barn, the sound of his boots firm on the packed earth. She heard the familiar nicker of his horse, the jingle of harness. While he saddled the animal, Sarah smoothed her apron, her mind a whirlwind of practicality and a strange, detached sense of unreality. Marriage. Today. To a man she barely knew, yet whose grief felt as familiar as her own pulse. She had no illusions about romance, no fluttering hopes for a tender courtship. This was a bargain struck from necessity, a covenant of mutual survival. She removed her apron, folding it neatly, and picked up the shawl she kept for cool evenings. There was no wedding dress, no veil, no joyous preparations. Just the quiet resolve of two people facing an uncertain future, together yet separate. Ethan led his sturdy gelding, Old Bess, to the front of the house. He didn't offer a hand up, but waited with an awkward patience as she arranged her skirts and settled onto the saddle in front of him. His arm came around her waist to hold the reins, his presence a solid, unyielding reality behind her. The contact was impersonal, functional, yet it was the closest they had been. They rode in silence, the moon a silver disk in the inky sky, casting long, dancing shadows. The night air was cool, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. The only sounds were the rhythmic clopping of Bess's hooves and the chirping of crickets. Sarah leaned back slightly, imperceptibly, against Ethan's chest, drawing a strange comfort from his nearness, from the steady beat of his heart she could almost feel against her back. It was a long ride to Reverend Thompson's small cabin, nestled in a hollow by the creek. The preacher, a kind, elderly man with gentle eyes, was clearly startled by their late-night arrival, his spectacles askew as he peered at them through the partially opened door. Ethan's explanation was brief, to the point. "Reverend, we need to be married." He offered no further details, and the Reverend, wise enough to recognize the gravity in the rancher's tone and the quiet solemnity of the woman beside him, asked few questions. He invited them into his humble parlor, lit by a single oil lamp. The room smelled of old books and dried herbs. The ceremony was short, the words of the marital rites ancient and profound, echoing strangely in the stillness of the night. To have and to hold, from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health. Sarah listened, the vows settling deep within her. Ethan's responses were low, guttural, each word seemingly pulled from a place of immense effort. When it came time for a ring, there was an awkward pause. Ethan had nothing. Sarah wore no jewelry. The Reverend, with a small, understanding smile, offered his own wife's plain gold band, which she had left him upon her passing. "Alone," he said gently, "until you can procure your own." Ethan slid the slightly too large band onto Sarah's finger. It felt heavy, a symbol of a promise made under extraordinary circumstances. "I now pronounce you man and wife." The Reverend's voice was soft, yet the words resonated with an undeniable finality. It was done. Sarah Miller was now Sarah Blackwood. A wife. In the space of a single day, her life had irrevocably changed. The ride back to the Blackwood ranch was as silent as the journey to the preacher's, yet the quality of the silence had shifted. It was no longer the silence of two strangers sharing a path of convenience, but the silence of two people bound by vows, by a name, by a shared roof that was now, legally and spiritually, a shared home. The moon, their sole witness on the trail, seemed to cast a softer, more benevolent light. Sarah felt the unfamiliar weight of the borrowed gold band on her finger, a tangible reminder of the commitment made. It was a strange, disorienting sensation, this sudden transformation from employee to wife. She was acutely aware of Ethan behind her, his arms still steadying her, his presence a constant, grounding force. He offered no words of comfort, no endearments, nor did she expect them. Theirs was not a union born of whispered affections, but of stark realities and a mutual, unspoken acknowledgement of profound loneliness. Yet, as they drew closer to the ranch, a sense of fragile hope, like the first pale light of dawn, began to stir within her. The house, when it came into view, no longer looked quite so desolate. Perhaps it was the moonlight, or perhaps it was the change within herself, but it seemed less a tomb of sorrow and more a place of potential, a canvas upon which a new, uncertain future might be painted. Ethan reined Bess to a halt before the porch. He dismounted, then turned to help her down. His hands, calloused and strong, were surprisingly gentle as they spanned her waist, lifting her easily to the ground. For a moment, they stood facing each other, the space between them charged with unspoken questions, unspoken fears, unspoken possibilities. The crickets sang their nightly chorus, the wind sighed through the pines, the vast, indifferent wilderness their witness. "It's late," he said, his voice still rough, but lacking its earlier harshness. A simple statement of fact, yet it seemed to hold a deeper meaning, an acknowledgement of the monumental shift that had occurred. Sarah nodded, unable to find words. The weariness of the day, the emotional weight of its extraordinary events, settled upon her. He gestured towards the door. "You should rest," he did not say, my wife, did not presume a closeness that had not yet been earned. Inside, the main room was dark, save for the faint glow of dying embers in the hearth. The shadows danced, familiar yet somehow different now. This was her home. Not just a place of employment, but her home. Ethan lit a lamp, the sudden flare of light chasing some of the shadows into the corners. He turned to her, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. He still wore his grief like a shroud, but perhaps, just perhaps, there was a tiny rent in the fabric, a place where a sliver of light might eventually penetrate. He looked towards the narrow hallway that led to their separate rooms. The small room off the pantry, her room. And his own, larger chamber, the one he had once shared with Eliza, a room she had never seen. The unspoken question of the night hung heavy in the air. This was the precipice of their new life, a life forged in desperation, bound by expediency, yet holding the faintest, most tentative promise of something more. Ethan cleared his throat, a rough sound in the charged silence. "That, the master bedroom it has been empty a long time," he paused, the words costing him. "You should take it. It's warmer." Larger, it was an offering, a gesture of respect, perhaps even a hesitant step towards a shared existence beyond the purely functional. Sarah looked at him, surprised by the offer. Eliza's room. The heart of his grief. For him to suggest she occupy it was a significant concession, a crack in the wall he had built around himself. She understood the weight of it. "Thank you, Ethan," she said softly. "But the small room is fine for now." It is familiar she did not want to push, to presume. Their new reality was too fragile, too new. Healing, if it was to come, needed time, needed space. He nodded slowly, a flicker of something she couldn't decipher in his eyes, relief, or perhaps a renewed awareness of the chasm that still lay between them. He gestured towards the larger room. "As you wish. But it is your right, your right." The words resonated. She was his wife. This house, its comforts and its sorrows, were now hers to share, in whatever way they both could manage. He picked up his hat from the peg by the door, a gesture so ordinary yet imbued with a new significance. He would not be sleeping in the main house tonight as he sometimes did, restless on the old settee. He would go to his own room. Their separate rooms. "Good night, Sarah," he said, the name sounding a little less foreign on his tongue. "Good night, Ethan," she replied. He turned and walked down the narrow hall, his footsteps echoing softly, until he disappeared into the darkness of his room. Sarah stood alone in the lamplight, the borrowed ring a cool weight on her finger. She looked around the main room, at the shadowy outlines of furniture, at the hearth where the embers still glowed faintly. The house was still steeped in the memory of Eliza, still held the echoes of Ethan's profound sorrow. But tonight, something was different. A tiny seed of hope had been planted in the barren soil of their lives. It was a fragile thing, easily crushed, yet it was there. She walked to the window, pulling back the curtain slightly. Outside, the Wyoming night was vast and silent, the stars like scattered diamonds on black velvet. A new day would dawn soon, bringing with it the familiar chores, the quiet rhythms of ranch life. But it would be a new day for Sarah Blackwood, wife. And for Ethan Blackwood, a man who had, in a single, desperate act, perhaps taken the first, hesitant step out of the deepest shadows of his grief. She let the curtain fall, a sense of profound weariness washing over her, but beneath it, a quiet, resilient strength. Home. The word whispered in her mind. It was a beginning, stark and uncertain, but a beginning nonetheless. And in the quiet solitude of the remote Wyoming ranch, under the watchful eyes of the distant stars, that was enough.